Hey everybody, it's Debbie.meighan with Washington Fine Properties, and I'm here today with Jonathan Ressler. He's with the Loudoun County Fire Marshals. He is an investigator, and we're here today to talk about barn fire safety. So, hey Jonathan, why don't you give us a little bit of background about what you do with the Fire Marshal's office and how you came to be there?
Okay, so I started with the county in 2005. When I originally came to Loudoun County, I was with the Sheriff's Office. I worked as a deputy in patrol and some other aspects of the Sheriff's Office. In 2018, I transitioned to the Fire Marshal's office. It's very similar. Obviously, I'm still involved in law enforcement. My primary responsibilities are the investigation of structure fires or vehicle fires, hazardous material spills, and anything involving explosives. We also do code enforcement.
Ah, I see. So when we're talking about for farm owners, such as a horse farm owner, what are the typical things that you see? Mostly structure fires?
The vast majority are going to be structure fires, unfortunately, and most of those are going to be accidental. We also see equipment fires, or what we would consider a vehicle fire. So anything that has wheels on it. If your tractor burns, that's what we consider a vehicle fire.
Well, I can't imagine a bigger, like a horse owner's biggest nightmare is for their horse to be involved in a barn fire. So what are the most typical reasons that you would see a barn fire?
Most of the fires in Loudoun County are generally accidents, and that holds true as well to the structure fires.
Mm-hmm. And what typically causes them? What are these accidents?
Most of our accidents in Loudoun County are caused by electrical issues. Some of them still are smoking material issues, and you'll see, obviously it's posted here, no smoking, and you want to make sure that that's something that you enforce, but then you need to take into consideration the appliances and some of the electrical wiring in the barn as well.
Wow, interesting. So let's take a look at some of the possible electrical problems that could cause problems in your barn.
Okay.
So when you walk through a barn and you're looking for potential problems, what are the type of things that you're looking for?
So the vast majority of our fires are going to be electrical, as we explained. So I'm looking for things like extension cords. I understand that there are times that we need to maybe run an extra fan or we need to run an extra heater or something, but if we're going to have any kind of a long-term use, we want to make sure that we're getting it hardwired into the structure, and we're using a certified electrician to do that. If we have to use an extension cord, we want to make sure that the extension cord is heavy duty and it's going to be UL tested.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know a lot of barn owners are pretty handy and they like to do a lot of do-it-yourself projects. So you really feel like having the certified electrician doing the work is key.
You really want to make sure that so if you feel confident with it, then take the time to have the county inspect it. Because that just makes sure it doesn't cost a lot for the permit. The inspectors will come out and make sure that it's up to code.
Perfect. So taking a look at some of the things that are in this barn, we've got the stall heater. Something like this is something that you really want to take a good look at.
Yes, so with something like that, you want to make sure that it's properly secured. We don't want to just throw it up on a couple of little hooks or throw some baler's wire around it to hold it in place. Something that's going to produce heat, we want to make sure that it's securely fastened. Same as if you're lucky enough to get some baby chicks or some baby ducks in the springtime and it's starting to get cold at night. We don't want to just use the little clips. We want to make sure that that heater's securely fastened. We want to make it a permanent part of that barn while we're using it.
Yeah, I have to say guilty as charged on that one. I have definitely used those temporary heaters for chicks. Whoops. So do not do that. So other things that we take a look at for electrical is like the outlets and switches.
Yeah, we want to make sure that the outlets are designed for the environment that we have. So barns, although they're very much like a house, they're a completely different environment. We have a lot more moisture, we have a lot more dust, we have a lot more animals involved. So we want to try to protect the wiring, we want to try to protect the outlets. So we want to make sure that the outlets have covers on them to keep the dust and the moisture out. We want to make sure the switches are designed for a dusty environment. And if we have a lot of wiring, we want to be periodically inspecting it to make sure that the rodents aren't messing with it.
Absolutely. So having that exterior wiring like in conduit so that it can't be chewed
Saves
on.
you the time of having to go back and periodically inspect it.
It is more expensive to do it that way, but it's well worth the cost.
Absolutely.
So Jonathan, I know that the biggest culprit when it comes to appliances are those clip-on heaters, but are there any other appliances that could be a problem?
So looking here, we have a refrigerator that, and I'm not going to look to see if it is, but we want to keep in mind that anytime we're running an appliance in a barn, we want to make sure that it's designed for the type of environment that it's in. I know some refrigerators shouldn't be in garages. It's probably similar environment with the barn because of the dust. If you just look at the top here, you can see how much dust is starting to build up on it. And that's going to get into the motor area, and that's going to cause an issue with it and potentially cause it to overheat. And this dust, this fine dust here, is just going to be essentially kindling for it. With that, we have a lithium-ion battery up here. And unfortunately, lithium-ion batteries are becoming a major fire hazard, particularly when they're plugged in all the time. Unfortunately, if they start to overheat and basically run away while they're charging, basically they just become almost an explosive here. They'll pop, and the gas is extremely flammable, and it just takes off. And there's really no way to stop it as a homeowner at that point.
Oh my gosh, that sounds terrifying. So that's similar to like the stories we hear about the lithium batteries on airplanes.
Correct.
Oh wow, I never even thought of that. That's a really good tip. Don't keep those drills plugged in.
Yeah, you want to make sure that it's plugged in. Here it's just plugged into an outlet. If you're going to plug it in, you can try to plug it into a surge protector and hope that that's going to cut it. But with a lithium-ion battery, once it starts to overheat, it kind of takes off on its own, even if you pull the power on it.
Understood. So I think we were discussing this earlier, that the biggest difference between like the home accident and the barn accident is that you're not always in the barn.
Correct. Unfortunately, in a barn environment, if you're not standing right there, by the time you realize it, it's probably because it's already burned through the roof.
So we're in the hay storage room here, and you can see we have a few nice bales here. What is a problem with hay and barn fire safety?
So anytime you have an organic material like this that is stored close together, you run the risk of spontaneous combustion. Typically it happens soon after it's been baled. So you want to make sure that you're getting your hay from a reputable dealer or someone that you trust. And if you have any concerns over it, you can get a probe. If you look online, or if you contact your tractor sales department or farm supply store, you can go ahead and get a probe, and it's going to be a thermometer similar to like you would have for a meat thermometer with a long probe in it. And you stick it in the center and leave it in there for a period of time, and it'll give you an idea what the temperature is in the bale. If that bale is starting to spontaneously or starting to overheat, that could lead to spontaneous combustion, you're going to notice a period of temperature rising.
So what we're looking for is a trend of the temperature getting higher.
So I sent you some links from Lisa Braun. She's our pub ed for the Fire Marshal's office. And one of them actually talks about the process of testing it. And I roughly remember that you'll stick the probe in about every 4 hours to check and see if the temperature is rising. And I want to say that it does talk about if you're starting to get above this temperature, then you want to be careful. And the other thing to consider is as it's overheating, all that hay is packed tightly together. If you realize you have a problem, you want to get the fire department standing by when you go to take it out of the barn. Because as you start to pull it out, you're going to introduce some oxygen, and that's really the only thing that you're missing at that point. Because you have the fuel and you have the heat, it's because it's compressed that it hasn't started a fire yet.
Understood. So the probe is testing the temperature of it. Would a moisture meter also be useful, or?
I don't think you're going to get the same kind of reading because you really are concerned about the temperature inside the bale. We're not worried about how moist it is or whether it's going to affect the feeding. We're worried about the internal temperature. Because once the bale gets to the point where it is hot enough to combust, all that it needs is the oxygen, and it's going to start cooking from the inside out. And as soon as it gets to the outside and it gets that oxygen, it's going to be an issue. And it doesn't matter how moist the bale is because it's already dried everything out from the inside.
Yeah, that is a really good point. So in addition to probing the bales for their temperature and keeping an eye on that, is there anything that you can advise a barn owner to do in terms of like how we store our hay?
In a perfect world, we keep all of our combustible materials away from our barn. Or we try to limit how much oxygen it has. So in this case here, this room's completely enclosed. So if a fire started in here, it's going to use up all the oxygen and it's going to limit how much damage that fire can do. We want to do the same thing with our mechanical equipment as well. Try not to store our tractors inside the barn. Try not to keep our lawnmowers inside the barn. The more we can keep those kind of things outside the barn, the less we're introducing risks to that environment.
Understood. So Jonathan, why don't you point out a few things that the barn owners here are doing right?
So as you saw when we walked in, they have a fire extinguisher actually mounted on the wall at both ends of the barn. And with that, if you notice, there's another fire extinguisher on the ground. So it looks like they're paying attention and replacing them when they're supposed to be replaced, rather than just, oh, I have a fire extinguisher and walking by it all the time. The great thing about having the time to replace a fire extinguisher is it gives you the opportunity to practice with the one that you're getting ready to throw out. And if you've never used a fire extinguisher, it's a great training opportunity, or you can train some of your farm staff on how to use the fire extinguisher properly.
Yeah, that's an excellent idea, and actually sounds like kind of fun.
The other thing I noticed is that they have water at both ends of the barn as well, and they have it hooked up to a hose so it's readily available. If there's something that they need to put water on quickly, they can pop that hydrant open and they've got the hose right there. So again, that's at both ends of the barn, so it doesn't matter what end you're working in or what end, if the fire's at one end and you're coming in from the other, then you have the opportunity to access that fire suppression capability.
Sounds good. So we're back outside. Jonathan, what are the things we can do as barn owners to have more safety for fires outside the barn?
Well, anytime we're doing cleanup around the barn, we want to make sure that if we're going to build a burn pile, we keep it as far away from the barn as we can, because we don't want to run the risk of a dry field possibly spreading to the barn. And with that comes some of the construction that we can consider. So our landscape, we want to try to avoid having flammable materials up against the barn. If you look, they have stone covering the first couple of feet between their driveway and where it meets the wood siding. So if there's a fire that starts to come up, it creates a bit of a break between where those flames or those sparks have to jump across to get to the siding. We don't have wood mulch up against the barn.
So you're saying that wood mulch is not the best material to use in those situations?
Unfortunately,
Guilty as charged.
Unfortunately, it looks good and it's inexpensive, but it's also flammable.
Good point. So Jonathan, the worst has happened and a fire started. What should we do as barn owners?
Well, I'm going to kind of backtrack a little bit here and say that if you have the opportunity, you want to reach out to your local station and ask them to come out and do a site visit. When they come out, they'll go ahead and walk the property, and that gives them an opportunity to do a pre-plan. And they'll take notes, they'll figure out where the nearest water sources are, they'll figure out if there's anything particular to your structure that they want to keep in mind, if there's any hazardous materials that are stored on the property, where your propane tanks and things like that are. And they'd make all those notes and they have it readily available. So if an emergency happens at the address, it pops right up. And they're able to share that from one shift to the next and take that information, relay it, and they'll relay it over the radio to all the other units that are coming in from other stations. And
Wow.
that shortens the amount of time that they need to be on scene trying to figure things out.
So I had no idea that the fire department could keep that kind of information. That's amazing. So I would definitely recommend that to any farm owner to have a pre-plan like that.
Yeah, I understand that a lot of times we like to have our country homes and be private and keep sort of everyone else off the property, but fire emergency services are one of the people you want to invite in and give them an opportunity to get to know the property.
That's a really good point. So let's say we unfortunately have had the worst.
Okay.
The worst has happened, and we need a procedure. Hopefully, as part of that pre-plan, they're giving us kind of a checklist as to what we should do. But of course, you're freaking out because your barn's on fire. What should I do?
Well, we're all animal lovers, and I understand that your first thought is going to be to try to get the animals out of the building, but you need to get the emergency services started. You've got to get that call to 911 placed so that we as emergency responders can get started. As well trained as we are, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know there's a fire until somebody tells us. Once you get 911 started and the emergency services are coming, then you can go back and worry about if there's any animals you want to get out. And in those cases, you really want to be careful about particularly large animals, horses, for example. You want to get them as far away from the structure as you can before you cut them loose. If you simply run through the barn and open up the doors, the horses are likely going to stay in the barn because to them, this is a safe space and they want to stay in that safe space. They don't understand that the fire is going to hurt them. So you want to lead them away from the barn, get them as far away from the barn where they're not going to interfere with the emergency services and there's no risk that they're going to come running back in.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I will add that the thing that you see on TV or movies, you do not have to put something over your horse's eyes to lead them out of a barn in a fire. Your horse will want to go, believe
Yes,
me.
and if they're not used to it, you're likely going to startle them more than help the situation.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for helping us learn more about how we can be safer around the barn when it comes to fire safety. I really appreciate your time.
Sure, I was glad to be here, and as I mentioned earlier, I think I went ahead and provided you some information. There's a checklist from Virginia Tech that you can go through and look over your property, and it's just a quick, you just kind of run down through the pages and basically you add up the number of points you've accumulated. The more points, the more risk you have for being a fire hazard. There's also an article there from the Humane Society that talks about both post-construction things like we talked about wiring and having fire extinguishers, as well as pre-construction thoughts to keep in mind. And Loudoun County, of course, provides a quick one-page, just look it over, some information to keep in mind as well.
And links to all of this material will be in the comments of this video.